We just had a pre-launch talk by the amazing Stephanie M on integrating games through PowerPoint in the classroom. And now we are waiting to join a talk by Dr. Andrew Latham, who will be discussing, here we go, speedrunning on the Legend of Zelda. So let's just wait while the host gets us started. I'm not really sure why we don't have audio. Let me see if I can get that fixed.
And now he is an assistant professor of English at Midland College, where he researches rhetoric and composition in video games. So, Andrew, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my second time at The River Speaks, so I always really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I want to thank everybody, of course, for facilitating this, accommodating me, and all that is in between. Today, we are going to look at The Legend of Zelda. We're primarily going to focus on Ocarina of Time, but I've got a few more that I'm going to talk about briefly as sort of other examples of this research that I do. But we're going to go ahead and get started. So, to begin, my name, as they mentioned, is Dr. Latham. I'm an assistant professor of English at Midland College. I'm also a very avid gamer. I've been a fan of the Legend of Zelda series for over 2 decades. And my son, who is possibly watching this right now, Eli, I'm very sorry I can't play it with you right now. I will later, I promise. My research today focuses on hypertext rhetoric to analyze video games. And some people may not necessarily know what hypertext is. That's okay. In this case, I want you to think of hypertext as something similar to Wikipedia. It's an electronic source that has links that let readers navigate at random rather than in a specific sequence. And generally speaking, the more links, the more rhetorically persuasive hypertexts are to readers. And this is sort of how you get the wiki wormhole phenomena, where you start on one article and you end up in something completely unrelated to that initial subject. But you keep clicking and you keep going because because you're compelled to, because it's rhetorically persuasive. You want more. So, my initial crux for this argument is reading Zelda. And even though we're going to focus on Ocarina of Time, like I mentioned, some other Zelda games are worth mentioning here because they inspired me for parts of these researches that I do. So first, I became interested in this argument while playing The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening on the Nintendo Switch. And that's the game that is in the upper right hand with Link taking out the little worm guy. I'd never played it before, much to my regret. So one of the things that I did was I suggested that my wife and I play it together because she had never played a Zelda game before. And what we did was we alternated files. She played first, I played second most of the time. And the initial spark for this conversation came when, during gameplay, I sort of just casually chucked a bomb at a cracked wall and opened a secret room. And my wife, she asked me, why did you do that? How did you know that that was there? And I didn't know how to immediately answer because the solution seemed very obvious, very simple. And I just kind of muttered, cracked wall. And you can see the cracked wall there in the circled section of the screenshot. And what I later realized as my wife continued to play the game was that I could read it in a way that she couldn't. And that literacy was born from several decades of playing these kinds of games. I realized the cracked wall meant I needed to throw a bomb at it, which would produce a secret entrance. I knew how to navigate that link, which has a fun double meaning because we're talking about The Legend of Zelda, which of course stars the protagonist Link. And eventually what happened was she also started picking these up. She often mentions them to me while I'm playing and she's watching. She often finds them when she would find them when she was playing herself. And she learned how to navigate those links. And, even if it's not quite as proficient yet, that'll come with time, with experience. And it creates a certain set of fluency with the game's visual language. And this anecdote, the idea of, oh, well, I stumbled on something secret, now I know how to do that in the future, that should be immediately familiar to anyone that's played a Legend of Zelda game, or even played games in general. And Zelda games have very specific sequences, at least prior to Breath of the Wild in 2017. One learns to read the game, forming a literacy not only with the game's narratives, but also its ludology, which is how the gameplay works. In fact, another example of this on the bottom right-hand corner is Skyward Sword, a game that I'm currently playing with my son. And in Skyward Sword, you have to get this item that's on screen. This is called the item wheel. And this allows you to hold down the B trigger and access your items over the course of the adventure to solve puzzles. The thing is, this item wheel doesn't actually exist in your inventory until you acquire the first item, the slingshot, which is on the bottom. If you skip the slingshot, if you don't get it at all, you can't get any of these items ever during your game. So Zelda games used to be like this. They used to be very linear. They used to be structured like puzzles. You had to figure out, you had to navigate, you had to learn the links. And these are just a few examples of how these links work if you view a video game as a hypertext. What I didn't necessarily realize at the time I saw this cracked wall was my ludology's limitations. And this is perhaps due to the fact that I am I'm a very basic gamer, so to speak. I'm able-bodied. Games tend to be oriented towards my target demographic. And because of that, I failed to notice what should be a very obvious blind spot in the way this literacy formed. One that made itself very obvious several months later. And it brings me to the subject of my talk, which is on the left-hand side of the screen, blind players of the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. So, Jordan Werner, blind players and the limitations of play. So in 2006, long before I sit down to even start building this talk, a person named Jordan Werner posted on a Zelda speedrunning community website. And they were seeking help in playing and beating the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Werner's a blind man. He asked the veteran speedrun community, and trust me when I say this, when I tell you that speedrunners and people that are part of their community, they know way more about these games than I or indeed anyone in the chat possibly does. They have a mastery of this that surpasses even my own. And Werner asked the players, help me play this game, help me beat this game. And I'm not the first person to note the unusualness of this request. In Blind Spots, The Phantom Pain, the Helen Keller Simulator, and Disability in Games, which is a chapter of 2017 book by Stephanie Beaulieu and Patrick Lemieux. I possibly mispronounced those names, I apologize. They wrote about his experiences and his encounters with speedrunners. Speedrunners, for those who are unfamiliar with the term in the chat, are a sub-discourse community of video game players who specialize in breaking, glitching, and racing through video games in order to achieve faster and faster times. I've often found this description of how the speedrunning community works to be very useful to me. Beyond considerations of the text within the game, speedrunners collaborate to write routes, text-based instructions or directions, detailing the fastest way to complete a video game given what techniques and exploits are known at that time. For speedrunners like Narcissa Wright, some of the most visually spectacular games for their time become reduced to sequences of input or text-based instructions. And this is a really fascinating way to look at video games. Another definition of speedrunning, provided also by Beaulieu and Lemieux earlier in their work, helps readers understand the significance of this practice among players. Speedruns, or fast playthroughs of video games, are metagames that encourage the discovery and manipulation of exploits not immediately evident to the player or accepted as legitimate forms of play. Speedrunning is not only a metagame contingent on the virtuistic performance of real-time play, but also a collaborative form of play based on discovering exploits such as geometry clipping, cutscene skipping, sequence breaking, and memory manipulation. Games within the game. Now, Bolu and Lemieux focus a great deal on the technical aspects of these play styles, their composition, if you will. Instead, if we look at these exploits and routes not as exploits, but forms of ludology, they become instead player ludologies, which can be used in hypertext rhetoric to analyze the game in a new way. And I proposed an argument like this similar to that in my dissertation, where I described an approach to video game rhetoric called ludo-ludo theory. In ludo-ludo theory, the video game becomes a hypertext similar to a database, like Wikipedia, which is malleable and subject to change in order to accommodate players. In ludo-ludo theory, player ludologies come into harmony and dissonance with the ways in which the maker's ludologies function. And the objective of this is to align them in harmony or explain their dissonance. Now, this is similar to the Japanese concept of tegotai, which is a design philosophy from Nintendo. Shigeru Miyamoto is sort of the one that people usually quote on this, but it's a design philosophy which focuses on how a game feels and why players feel in or out of alignment with the game's ludology. If the game or the route feels right, it gains ludo-ludo harmony because the player's play style is accommodated. This means the game is playable, which means it won't crash, and it can be completed with the right knowledge of hyperlinks. While dissecting the differences between Werner's blind run and blindfolded ones, like this one, Bolu and Lemieux focus on the fact that both use Lynx's sword in Ocarina of Time as a metaphor for a cane. This distinction between the two models of a cane also illustrates the difference between Werner and Whistler, who is a speedrunner who assisted Werner's play. Although in both cases the sword is tapped as an auditory tool, much of Whistler's struggle is produced through the disconnect between the auditory information revealed by his cane and his mental map, a virtual visuality of the space developed through years of sighted play. By contrast, Werner is not using the sword to build a mental map of the space, but to check and avoid obstacles he knows are coming. It's no coincidence that Werner transformed The Legend of Zelda into a text-based adventure game by translating the actions into a series of textual commands for him to follow. This position is similar to the observation I made while playing Link's Awakening with my wife. The game contains a literacy that, if a player is fluent in it, can be used to uncover secrets in the text. Ocarina of Time, whether knowingly or unknowingly by the game's designers, is built for this type of gameplay. Surfaces in the game have specific noises that will issue when struck by the sword, hook shot, or other weapons. Slicing a sign will prompt a different noise than striking a metal object like an enemy's shield. However, it's important to note that this ludology is seemingly undeliberate on the part of the game's makers. There are examples these days of game designers reaching out to disabled players and accommodating their needs. A great example of this is the Xbox Adaptive Controller, which in 2018 featured heavily in Microsoft's advertising strategies, and this is a still from their Super Bowl commercial. The Adaptive Controller shows that accessibility was forefront in Microsoft's marketing strategy. And this style of play by Werner, however, is very different. It's very much not what was intended by Ocarina of Time's design philosophy. And we're going to talk about that design philosophy because it's, ironically, the things that Ocarina of Time does with its game design make it so influential to us now as video game rhetoricians, but they make it so inaccessible to people that are not accommodated. So, what is Ocarina of Time? And why is it so challenging to play for blind players? Ocarina of Time is a lot of things. It is the 5th game in Nintendo's Legend of Zelda series. It is the first game in the Zelda series to use 3D graphics, which shifts from the 2D format of previous games like Link to the Past, the original Legend of Zelda, and Zelda 2: Adventure of Link. It was released for the Nintendo 64 in 1998. It's one of the most influential games ever made. If you don't have this on your list, it's a canon text, almost. It's also painstakingly obvious that because of its role in developing 3D gaming, it is not meant with handicapped players in mind. Ocarina of Time practically, and I use that term practically here with a little bit of irony because Werner and other blind players prove that this is not exactly true. It practically requires sight to play. Yes, you could have a player could have someone read the story to them through text boxes because it doesn't really have voice acting. But the use of 3D space and 3D puzzles make playing the game sans sight very challenging. Hookshot and longshot grips become difficult because not every surface of the game will react to the hookshot item. Aiming becomes tricky. There's this forest temple boss here, or mini boss, which requires sight to function because the boss splits into 4 and only one of them will spin around to let you know which one is the real one. All of this trickiness, all of these groundbreaking design philosophies are because it relies on 3D exploration and discovery. The Nintendo 64 made such gameplay much more easier to implement than in previous systems. Efforts on the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis are really great examples of how limited 3D gameplay was at that time. And even the Sony PlayStation, which was a rival console for Nintendo, struggled with this style of gameplay at the beginning too. A great example of this is Crash Bandicoot, released in 1996. And it also uses 3D exploration and 3D platforming to function, but it has these very narrow corridors, and this is very specifically designed to limit the number of artifacts the game has to render at a time. The Nintendo 64 also implemented one of the first mass-scale joysticks, which allowed easier 3D movement to translate onto the screen. And I think I speak for all of us when I say that that joystick, while groundbreaking, was a terrible piece of technology, and we are all suffering from it to this day. Let me know in the chat if you agree with this. All of these elements combine together to create a game experience that, while groundbreaking for its time, is very ableist. And honestly, I would doubt that Shigeru Miyamoto and his team gave even a second's worth of thought to whether there would be a blind players years later, and they would like to be accommodated to experience their story. But this talk isn't necessarily focused on disability studies, even though disability studies would have a field day talking about this particular subject. Nor is it about metagaming, the term that most academics use to describe speedrunning. Metagaming, particularly as it's defined in academia today, focuses a lot of its efforts into the mechanisms behind play, its composition. Werner's run is not a recontextualized text-based experience simply because he's being guided through the game by other players through a route optimized for him. He isn't just following directions, he's playing a game. So instead, let's look at the game as a hypertext, subject to player malleability and style of ludology. Instead of asking how they built routes for blind players, it would be more fruitful to wonder why the route has ludo-ludo harmony at all. Why does the game function correctly despite this shift away from the preconceived assumptions of the game makers? And here, hypertext rhetoric can help. So, in my dissertation, I explored applications of using hypertext rhetoric, such as those used to explore the rhetorical strategies of databases like Wikipedia. I began this research using George Landau's Hypertext 3.0, which offered me the most comprehensive understanding of hypertext rhetoric at that time. According to Landau, true hypertexts are electronic in nature. Second, they are built using branching systems that encourage reader choice in navigation. Third, hypertext authors use rhetorical links to sway readers of the hypertext. Finally, even though Landau himself didn't really like to give this idea a whole lot of thought, he admits that readers have the ability to manipulate hypertexts and take on a type of authorial role in the creation of a hypertext. Wikipedia as a model is a great, easy to understand variant of this and how this rhetorical concept works. A reader can click on a link, then another to create a route through the hypertext solely their own. And this produces rhetorical persuasion because the reader is navigating through the text harmoniously. And that rhetorical strategy convinces readers to keep navigating, engaging in the text, and drifting into the wiki wormhole. Through the use of speedrunning practices, glitch rhetoric, and platform studies, I was able to build a system where the canons of hypertext rhetoric, which were revised by Colin Gifford Brooke in 2009, would work in the analysis of video games. What these blind runners are doing is navigating the text using slightly different links to manipulate their reading. And this work is possible also thanks to one of our organizers here, Dr. Johansson Keanu, who used a model to offer several critical readings that considered the aesthetic, ludic, narrative, and oral design choices and the relationship between these elements as framed through a rhetorical and player-based reader response lens. Keanu offered that the convergence of these design choices allows for a more interdisciplinary approach that considers all the game's elements. Within the context of race, gender, or economics, which would yield a deeper and more thorough understanding of video game texts. In his work, music and tone shifts in audio rhetoric used to analyze how Nier Automata, which is another game, crafts a ludo-oral harmonious experience. In his work, the ludology and audio rhetoric work together to support player choices, which generate softer or more active music depending on player choice and agency. But let's think of Werner's ludology in a separate way. Instead of the audio rhetoric being used to support player choices, what if the audio in the game is producing links that Werner can manipulate to achieve a ludology for blind players? And let me explain. Let's take a moment in Ocarina of Time. The discovery of a Daegu Baba inside the Great Deku Tree, the first dungeon of the game. Immediately, the soft, gentle sounds of the tree fade into the background, and a more active, engaging audio experience begins. You know you've stumbled on something. Move forward. Move forward. You hear chomping. something is nearby. The chomping means the Daegu Baba is here and you're near it. Press Z. Now you're targeted. Now you can move forward and get close. You hear a rearing noise. You hear Link grunt. You hear Link stumble. If you've got a rumble pack, maybe you feel that. It snapped at you. Get up, try again, get closer. Keep pressing B. Suddenly you hear a sound like cutting a vine. It screams again. Third noise, it sticks. You hit, and then the music ends. You hear the sound of a small explosion. What if that's not the game responding to the player's actions? What if that's the game listening and offering the player a link to know what you're supposed to be doing? What you didn't see was the Daegu Baba chomping, rearing, getting ready to strike. But it's actually not necessary to see it happen. Ironically, the audio works so well that it can function on its own. It exists as a hyperlink that allows blind runners to advance even without the ability of seeing exactly when the Daegu Baba will rear and when it will strike. The game is more than it seems, so to speak, and looking below its surface level reveals many, many ways to manipulate the text that make it more inclusive. And to be sure, one of the most fascinating aspects of Werner's Run and the work done by other blind players of video games is how they reveal how accessible gaming can be if given the opportunity. I mean, yes, official examples exist for inclusion like the Xbox Adaptive Controller, but far, far more games exist that don't allow for these official examples. And the Xbox Adaptive Controller is not meant to help a blind player play this game, any more effectively than any other controller. To truly continue building knowledge about these texts, and this is a 20-year-old text, and we're still finding new ways to engage in it. Unofficial sources are necessary, and in Werner's case, more successful when it comes to helping players. However, hypertext rhetoric also affords so much more to these games because it asks questions about authorial agency in players like Werner who exploit the game's links to produce new pathways through the text. Now consider my point earlier about metagaming, focusing on composition, mechanics. And it would make sense to do that in a situation if Ocarina of Time was not a hypertext. And the metagame was more focused on what a player and video game can do as opposed to why they do these things. However, and to get to the end of this talk with some reasonableness on time, because I know that we have questions and I'm a little bit over where I was planning on being, shifting to an analysis of the Ludo-Ludo harmony created by Werner's Run is far more fascinating. It allows us to look at the run not as a person overcoming flawed design, but as a person exploiting existing design to bring the game into harmony. It also, more importantly, isn't the only example that I can think of when it comes to situations like this. And let me give you another example of something that I've been playing. I mentioned it earlier, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. He and I are working our way through this game right now. I think we're about to do the boss in the Fire Sanctuary. That's right. I promise we'll do that later. We've been playing for more than 20 hours, and Skyward Sword, to put it very bluntly, is a very linear game. Everything has to be completed in a precise order to the point where unless the player locates the slingshot at the beginning, as I mentioned, no other item, no claw shot, no bow, no whip, no I can't remember what the sand one is. I can't remember what the sand item is. Nothing can be obtained. But if you use alternate links in the text, players have found a way to bypass this requirement and even introduce the ludology present in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. For those of you that don't know, in Breath of the Wild, after you finish the tutorial area, you are free to go to the final boss immediately. And a lot of people do this. The record, I think, is around 20, 25 minutes to beat the game. This would previously be unthinkable, but players found a way to open a door, a very, very specific door, through the use of alternate links, alternate hyperlinks, that allow them to access the final boss and beat the game without doing any real dungeons, no items, no nothing. And I think the current record is about an hour and 21 minutes for the any percent category. Hour and 21 minutes to beat Skyward Sword. For those of you that have played Skyward Sword the way the game makers intended, that might seem to be amazing. But I think that it's important that we do this. I think it's important that we look at work like this because it asks a bunch of brand new questions. Why was this harmonious for me? Why did this feel right to me? Why was it important or special to me? It allows us to do analysis, yes, of methodology, of mechanics, of exploration, but it refocuses that analysis on the purpose of players, whatever that purpose may be. And I think that's why this particular style of video game rhetoric is worth considering, worth thinking about, and ultimately leads to a more inclusive environment for players such as Werner, blind players, and everyone. So thank you very much. That is my talk. I hope that it was interesting. I hope that you found it enjoyable. And I'm more than happy to take a couple of questions on my research if you would like.
So if you have any questions for Dr. Latham, you can unmute yourself and you can turn on your camera if you wish, or you could put it in the chat.
Let's see.
Oops, sorry. I fixed that, Keanu, if you want to unmute yourself.
I was originally interested in this subject because I originally came to this subject because I really like Awesome Games Done Quick. And for those of you that are unfamiliar, Awesome Games Done Quick is a charity speedrunning event which happens twice a year. And they raise money in January for the Prevent Cancer Foundation and in the summer for Doctors Without Borders. And prior to that, I remember seeing it the first time, and it was a Sonic run particularly. And I remember thinking, well, why are they skipping everything? Why are they doing that? Why aren't they just playing the game as intended? And that sort of set me down this path where I thought to myself, oh, well, you can do this. And like a lot of research has gone into making these runs, these paths through the hypertext stable. What else can we use that for? Can we use that to bring more people into gaming? Can we use that to bring more people into these texts, which for a really long time were not particularly inclusive? So I really have Games Done Quick to thank for it, but I also have, the recent last couple of years in gaming discourse to thank for this, because it allowed me to see ways in which my perspective, my viewpoint was limited. If that answers your question. Okay.
It looks like Hannah has a question from Zelda Universe. She says, hi there, Hannah from ZeldaUniverse.com here. Can I ask what other primary, secondary texts you used when developing this? Were there other Zelda-specific academic texts that you came across?
So this is a great question. My research tends to specialize a great deal in actually non-academic texts. And usually what happens is I will find a text that sort of uses Zelda as an example among many, and I will see a couple of different options to do that. But usually in academic work, what you're doing is you're taking larger research that's been undertaken by somebody else and apply it to a new example. So a lot of times you get more specific deep dives into games like, for instance, Nier Automata, great example. Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain is another good example. And usually it happens that way, and you might get some more specific deep dives on indie games as well. I've seen a lot of work on The Last of Us as well. But I used a lot of research, actually, and this is more specific to the Zelda Universe people. I used a lot of work from Zelda Wiki to build this, because Zelda Wiki, for those of you that do not know, it is also a Wikipedia-like hypertext that Zelda Universe operates and maintains. And I was able to download a lot of information from that while I was building my dissertation. I have a lot of research from the speedrunning community to thank for that as well. As far as recommendations, that's actually kind of a tricky question. I would always recommend Racing the Beam, the Atari video game system, as a source for people that are just sort of getting started in how games work, how they produce meaning, because that's where platform studies initially comes from, which I love very, very much. Airseth's, oh no, I'm drawing a blank. Cybertext, that's another really big one for you to read if that's something that you're interested in. And a whole host of others, but I also get a lot of research from news sites. I get a lot of research from forums as well. There are a lot of enthusiasts out there that are not published, but still deliver very meaningful discourse that's worth looking at. That's a good question. I think part of the thing that holds that's a really good question, because I would agree with you in the sense that this sort of material would translate very, very well to, say, a composition environment, where you could very easily ask, well, how do we make this composition material more accessible? How do we bring it more into harmony? And I could see video games having a role in that. I think there still remains a great deal of work to be done in terms of what ways to employ video gaming. And I'd be interested to hear about that. You know, do we want to talk about playing a specific video game, finding different ways to do it? Do we want to think about building a video game and learning that? It all depends on the literacies that I think students bring to the table. Does that make sense? I see somebody on camera. Oh, that's the interpreter. Hello. Okay, so that's a great question. All right. Okay, so there are actually examples of this. Not just Breath of the Wild. There's Super Mario Brothers 3, where an inputting of a very specific sequence will access the end credits and things like that. They showed this very famously on Late Night with Stephen Colbert. They did it live. And the answer to this question is, does the game crash? So what happens in that particular speed run, I'm not 100% familiar with this exact route, but if I were to take a stab at it, what I would guess is they hit the thing so hard that it essentially sets them outside of a loading zone, which, because it doesn't know what to do, it just renders the next thing, which is, in this case, a boss with Ganon. And there are a lot of these. They're called ROM warps in Ocarina of Time, where you're accessing a door, but you access it in a very weird way, and it allows you to essentially teleport. They do this a lot in reverse dungeon order for Ocarina of Time, where they start with, the Gerudo Desert, and they make their way back to the Great Deku Tree. And essentially what they do is they load so many assets and they walk in a specific way where the mouth in the Great Deku Tree can't render properly, and it just lets them in. So there are lots of examples of this specific type of strategy, this specific type of gameplay. And I think what we have to focus on, in addition to, the underlying mechanics, as I mentioned, why? So why would we want to do that? And I want to say sometimes it's as simple as, I want to see if I can do this. I want to see if I can do this. And in a lot of ways that fuels a lot of Werner's run and a lot of blind players run. Can I do this? I want to do this. Can I do this? So Ludo theory challenges not only what players desire to do, but also why they would wish to do it in the first place. And I think that can raise a lot of questions as to, well, what are gamers looking for in games themselves? We have all of these very high. My wife and I joke about this, but we have all of these very hyper realistic games that you see the individual beads of sweat, you see all the little gore, the viscous, the mucus, all of these different things. But then you've got things like Untitled Goose Game, which the objective is to just be an awful goose to people. What do gamers want? What do players want for their games? And I think that things like this, where you take 2 minutes to beat a game, 2 minutes, then you get to Ganon. That just shows that there's a lot more versatility into why players engage with texts and why they're engaging with them in these particular ways. Does that make sense? I think so, yes. Oh yeah, there's a chance that I left that out or didn't explain that as artfully as I could have. So there's this great 2015 paper for anybody interested, the rhetorical question concerning glitch by Boyle. And in this paper, I used to have a copy of it literally in my desk. And then I cleared everything out when I decided to purge everything after I finished my dissertation. But in that study, Boyle makes this distinction between I think it's called an active and a passive glitch. So the active glitch being something that, the game makers are aware of, but they sort of don't mess with it. They sort of don't do it. They sort of don't do anything because it doesn't harm anything. And then a different type of glitch, which is unknown. And glitches can be a legitimate part of a game maker's vision. I think that we all know the infamous example of Lara Croft's appearance being the result of a deliberate glitch that was left in, basically. Yeah, dissertation purge, no kidding. But at the same time, you have things like the re-release of Ocarina of Time, the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D for the Nintendo 3DS, which included a boss rush mode that is very, very crucial to the way in which one of those routes is organized, specifically because they didn't code some of the doors properly. So it's something that can be active, that can be manipulated, and it's not intended. So there is a distinction that does have to be addressed, and some of this does fall into, well, what constitutes legitimate play? What constitutes fair and reasonable play? Things like everybody's played a shooter where somebody has an advantage like broadband access, or the speed at which they have their megabits per second set up gives them an unfair advantage over somebody that doesn't have that same setup. So there are some legitimate there is some level of distinction between what constitutes something intended by the game makers, like in Banjo-Kazooie, all the cheat codes, they are deliberate and they are put in there by the makers of the game, and something that's unintended, like exiting Kokiri Forest immediately without having gone through the Great Dega Tree or receiving the Fairy Ocarina. Does that make sense? Oh, that's a great example. Yeah. You can even extend it further. Like action replays are a great example. Action replays are great examples of this as well. Testing and debugging is a really, it's almost like a time-honored tradition in the speedrunning community to access these things as quickly as possible, like the screen where Ocarina of Time starts. You hear the music, you hear the title sequence, you see Link riding over Hyrule Field. That's a save file. And that's an actual save file that if you go through the hypertext correctly, you can access, and it will give you very nice goodies. So I think in some level, the line of authorship also becomes blurred to an extent, where the game maker goes, well, I didn't intend for this to be here, but this is what's here. But as players, we look at it and we see, but it's here.
All right, so it looks like that's all we have time for. I'm dropping a link to the next session in the chat. You should also have the link to evaluate this session and all sessions in the chat. So we will go ahead and see you in 10 minutes for Japanese role-playing games, genre, hardware, and the media ecology of Japan. See you guys later.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Bye, y'all.
And that has been Andrew Latham with a discussion on exploring ludology, harmony, and dissonance in the audiovisual rhetoric of the Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Shortly, we will move on to a discussion about Japanese role-playing games led by Noki Jarl Björnsson from the University of Iceland.